In the winter of 1095, beneath the cold stone arches of the Council of Clermont, a single speech by Pope Urban II ignited a fire that would consume 3 continents and centuries of human history. To the thousands gathered in the mud, it was a call to reclaim a holy city, but to the architects of power, it was something far more pragmatic. It was the birth of the first truly global venture capital project. For the first time in history, the fragmented, tribal lands of Europe found a singular, massive investment opportunity that required the total mobilization of their collective wealth. This was not just a march of faith. It was the moment the gears of the modern war economy began to turn. Before the first sword was drawn in the Levant, the landscape of Europe was a stagnant web of feudal estates where wealth was measured in dirt and grain rather than gold. There was no liquid capital, no international banking, and certainly no infrastructure to move tens of thousands of people across the world. The Crusades changed that by creating a desperate, immediate demand for everything. A knight heading to the east could not bring his fields with him. He needed to turn his land into cash. This massive sell-off triggered a liquidity event the likes of which the continent had never seen. Suddenly, land that had stayed in the same families for generations was being mortgaged or sold to the church and rising merchants. This massive influx of coin into the hands of soldiers meant that for the first time, money was moving and moving fast. As these armies began to march, they realized that the logistics of war were far more expensive than the weapons themselves. To move a single army across the Mediterranean required a navy that Europe simply did not have. This desperation breathed life into the maritime republics of Italy, specifically Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. These cities became the primary contractors for the Crusades, shifting their economies from simple fishing and local trade to high-output industrial military production. They built massive shipyards, the precursors to modern assembly lines, where they could churn out galleys with terrifying efficiency. The Venetians, in particular, realized that war was a service industry. It didn't just provide ships, it provided supplies, protection, and credit. This transition from feudalism to a logistics-based economy required a new way to handle money. Carrying chests of gold across bandit-tridden forests and pirate-infested seas was a death sentence for any business venture. Into this void stepped the poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. While they were feared warriors on the battlefield, their true contribution to history was their invention of the international wire transfer. A noble could deposit his wealth at a Templar preceptory in London or Paris and receive a coded letter of credit. Upon arriving in Jerusalem or Antioch, he could present that letter and withdraw the equivalent value in local currency. This system allowed wealth to bypass physical borders and physical risks. Laying the foundation for the global banking systems we use every single day, the Templars weren't just bankers. They were the first military-industrial complex. They owned farms, fleets of ships, and massive estates across Europe, all dedicated to feeding the war machine in the East. The profit from a vineyard in France was directly funneled into the purchase of chainmail in Damascus. This created a closed-loop economy where war was the primary product and the primary consumer. As the Crusades dragged on through the 12th and 13th centuries, the scale of the conflict forced kings and emperors to find even more creative ways to fund their campaigns. This led to the birth of systematic taxation. In England and France, special crusading taxes like the Saladin tithe were imposed, forcing every citizen to contribute a portion of their income to the war effort. What began as a temporary emergency measure soon became a permanent fixture of state power. As rulers realized that a population accustomed to paying for war was a population that could be controlled. While the kings were busy taxing their subjects, the Italian city-states were busy expanding their monopolies. The Fourth Crusade provides perhaps the most chilling example of the business of war. When the crusading army found itself unable to pay the Venetians the massive sum agreed upon for transport, the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, didn't cancel the contract. Instead, he renegotiated it. He used the crusading army as a private mercenary force to attack Venice's commercial rivals, eventually leading to the sack of Constantinople in 1204. This wasn't about religion. It was a hostile takeover of the most important trade hub in the world. The wealth of the Byzantine Empire was stripped bare and shipped back to Italy, fueling the start of the Renaissance. The gold that paved the streets of Venice and funded the art of Florence was, in many ways, the dividends of a war-driven investment. This cycle of debt and conquest began to change the very nature of European society. The demand for high-quality steel, horses, and refined textiles stimulated local industries that had been dormant since the fall of Rome. Smelters in Germany and weavers in Flanders found themselves working around the clock to meet the needs of the crusading states. This was a proto-industrial revolution sparked by the necessity of distance. Because the front lines were thousands of miles away, the supply chains had to be robust, standardized, and fast. The innovations born from this era-advanced shipbuilding techniques, double-entry bookkeeping, and the concept of the joint stock venture were all tools designed to make the business of war more efficient. The economic impact extended far beyond the battlefield into the very fabric of how cities were governed. To fund their participation in these holy wars, many feudal lords granted charters of freedom to their towns in exchange for lump sum payments. This effectively allowed the merchant class to buy their independence, leading to the rise of the European middle class. These burghers and guilds became the new engines of the economy, focusing on trade and manufacturing rather than agricultural output. As the crusade-driven demand for luxury goods like silk and spices grew, these merchants established permanent trading colonies in the East, creating the first European outposts of global trade that would eventually evolve into the colonial empires of the later centuries. As the Crusader states in the Levant eventually began to crumble, the economic machinery they built did not disappear. It simply pivoted. The banking networks established by the Templars and the Italians were repurposed to fund the growing bureaucratic states of Europe. The trade routes that had been opened to move soldiers were now used to move silk, spices, and sugar. The war economy had successfully integrated Europe into the global market, but it had also taught the West a dangerous lesson, that war could be the most profitable business of all. The debt cycles that started with knights mortgaging their manors evolved into the national debts of modern empires. The logistics that moved the Third Crusade across the desert evolved into the global supply chains that deliver products to our doorsteps today. Looking back, the Crusades were not just a series of religious conflicts. They were the laboratory where the modern world was forged. See the echoes of this era in every credit card transaction, every military budget, and every international trade agreement. The infrastructure of our modern life was built on the back of a medieval war machine that refused to stop turning. We live in a world defined by the liquid capital and the institutional debt that was first experimented with in the dusty counting houses of Acre and the marble halls of Venice. The story of the Crusades is the story of how Europe learned to turn conflict into a commodity. It is a reminder that the systems we often take for granted, banking, taxation, and international trade, were not born in a vacuum of peace, but in the heat of a desperate, centuries-long struggle for dominance. When we look at the skyscrapers of our financial districts, we are looking at the ultimate evolution of the Templar preceptory. The business of war never truly ended. It simply became the business of the world. Join us in the Money History Lab by subscribing for more stories behind the money.